You are driving home on a Tuesday night. Nothing unusual. Radio on, windows cracked. The kind of drive that doesn't register in your memory because there's nothing worth remembering about it. And then lights appear in your rearview mirror. Red and blue. Flashing. Your stomach does the thing it always does. You signal. You pull over. You roll down the window. You wait. A figure walks toward your car in the dark. Uniform. Badge. The posture of authority. You are already reaching for your license and registration because this is what you do. This is a script. This is a routine that everyone on that roadside understands. Now ask yourself this. How long did it take you to verify, in that moment, that the person walking toward your car was actually a police officer? Did you call 911 to confirm the stop? Did you ask to see a commission card? Did you compare the badge number against a public database? No. You did what almost everyone does. You assumed. You trusted the lights. You trusted the uniform. You trusted the performance of authority. And in most cases, that trust is warranted. But in the cases we are going to cover today, it wasn't. Because for some people, the uniform is not a symbol of a sworn commitment to protect the public. It is a costume, a prop, the centerpiece of an elaborate and sometimes dangerous performance that they have been rehearsing, in some cases, for their entire adult lives. A performance that real police officers have to interrupt, challenge, and bring to an end, often in ways that are stranger and more unsettling than anything a crime writer could invent. One man built a fake police force out of a funeral home escort company, went viral doing it, appeared on national television to deny it, failed a polygraph test he had volunteered to take, and is currently serving multiple prison sentences with no apparent intention of stopping if he ever gets out. One man showed up to active police crime scenes in full SWAT gear, told firefighters to stand back from a dead body, and convinced at least one real detective that he was a colleague, because his uniform was convincing enough and his confidence was absolute. And one man was simultaneously an assistant fire chief and a man pulling over innocent motorists on California roads in a truck he had secretly equipped with hidden police lights, for reasons that still don't fully make sense. All three of them were caught by real officers who got suspicious at exactly the right moment. And what happened when the mask came off is some of the most extraordinary footage and documentary evidence in the modern history of police impersonation. This is what happens when cops face imposters. Story 1. The funeral director who wanted to be the LAW Jeremy DeWitt, Central Florida, 2001, present. If you want to understand Jeremy DeWitt, start with the fact that he first impersonated a police officer at 18 years old, was convicted of it, went to prison for it, came out and built an entire company around the ability to look like law enforcement, and then kept impersonating a police officer anyway. For 20 years, across multiple Florida counties, with 18 vehicles, multiple recruited accomplices, and his own body camera, which he wore while pulling people over and which captured the entire thing in extraordinary detail. The desire to be a cop is a through line of Jeremy DeWitt's life, and the fact that it was a desire he could never legally fulfill, first because of age, then because of felony convictions, then because of a sex offender registration that permanently closed that door, is what makes this case so persistently baffling. Not because it's sympathetic, because it simply will not stop. How it began, and why it could never legitimately end. Jeremy Charles DeWitt was born in February 1980 in Central Florida. According to the account he has given in various interviews, he always wanted to be a police officer, not in the vague, general way that many children express an interest in uniformed professions, with a specificity and intensity that characterizes approach to everything. He attempted to enter the Police Explorers program as a teenager, a youth program affiliated with law enforcement that allows young people to learn about police work before they are old enough to join the academy. In 2001, while still a member of that program, he was charged with impersonating a police officer for the first time. He was not yet 21 years old. The charge should have been the end of the story. It was not. In 2003, he was charged again, a second impersonation conviction, and this time he received a nearly 2-year state prison sentence. He served his time and was released. Any realistic path to becoming an actual police officer was now permanently closed. A felony conviction disqualifies a candidate from law enforcement employment in Florida. Jeremy DeWitt could never become a cop. What he could do, what he did, was build the next best thing. Metro State Special Services and the 18 Car Force. By the mid-2010s, Jeremy DeWitt was running a company called Metro State Vehicle Protection Services, later known also as Metro State Special Services, that operated out of Central Florida and provided one specific, legitimate service: vehicle escorts for funeral processions. The legitimate version of this service involves escorting a funeral cortege from a church or funeral home to a cemetery, helping the procession stay together through intersections, managing the flow of the cortege safely through traffic. It is a genuine service with genuine demand, particularly in areas where funeral processions need to travel significant distances. What Jeremy DeWitt built around this legitimate call was something else entirely. By 2019, Metro State had grown to 18 marked vehicles, Crown Victorias, motorcycles, and other cars that were visually indistinguishable from actual police cruisers at anything less than close inspection. The fleet was equipped with police-style LED lighting and siren packages. DeWitt and his staff wore uniforms that closely resembled those of working law enforcement officers: tactical vests, duty belts, badges displayed on their chests and hips. The Florida licensing for funeral escort companies permitted Metro State to manage traffic flow within the immediate context of the procession. It did not permit them to pull people over. It did not permit them to issue directives to motorists outside the procession context. It did not give Jeremy DeWitt or anyone working for him any law enforcement authority whatsoever. None of that stopped DeWitt from operating as if it did. Video captured by his own body camera, footage that DeWitt himself recorded and, in a decision that still stuns investigators, posted to his own YouTube channel, shows him conducting traffic stops on Florida highways, pulling up behind vehicles, activating lights, approaching drivers' windows, directing motorists to produce documentation. In one incident, he positioned himself in the path of oncoming traffic to force a lane change, accelerating at speeds that other motorists described as terrifying. In multiple videos from his own recordings, DeWitt is shown berating motorists who question his authority with a kind of profane, aggressive language that would end a real officer's career on the spot. And when actual law enforcement showed up, in one encounter that became one of the most widely shared pieces of footage from his case, a real sheriff's deputy arrived at a funeral escort DeWitt was managing and told him directly that he was not permitted to stop other vehicles. DeWitt's response was to tell the deputy, a sworn, badged, commissioned officer of the law, to get out of his escort. His exact words, captured on his own body camera: "It doesn't matter. Get out of my escort, mother asterisk boy." He then directed other Metro State employees to follow the deputy as he drove away. That interaction did not end in DeWitt's arrest. He drove away. He kept the footage. He posted it online. And in an investigation dynamic that left observers genuinely incredulous, this behavior had been going on for years without resulting in prosecution. Previous law enforcement investigations into Metro State's practices had been dropped. Complaints had been filed and not followed up on. DeWitt had been conducting illegal traffic stops in plain sight, on camera, and posting the evidence himself for years, and nothing happened. Until John Mina became the Orange County Sheriff. The arrest that went viral. In October 2019, the Orange County Sheriff's Office arrested Jeremy DeWitt for impersonating a police officer. The charge was a third-degree felony under Florida law. The subsequent viral spread of DeWitt's own body camera footage, curated and posted by the YouTube channel Real World Police, drew national and international attention. Millions of people watched footage of DeWitt conducting fake traffic stops, berating motorists, and confronting real officers with a confidence that suggested he had genuinely convinced himself, on some level, that what he was doing was legitimate. In November 2019, he was arrested a second time for impersonation. In February 2021, he appeared on the television program Dr. Phil and denied being a police impersonator. He was given the opportunity to take a polygraph test, a test he volunteered for, apparently believing he would pass. He did not pass. The polygraph operator concluded he was not telling the truth about his impersonation activities. In March 2021, 1 month after the Dr. Phil appearance, he was arrested for impersonating a police officer again. At the time of this 2021 arrest, he was found with an imitation pistol. DeWitt is a registered sex offender, convicted in 2005 of sexual battery on a victim between 12 and 15 years old, which prohibits him from carrying firearms in Florida. In September 2021, a Florida judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison with 4 years of probation. Among the conditions of his probation was an order to shut down his YouTube channel, where the body camera footage had accumulated hundreds of thousands of views. He was released in 2022. In November 2022, he was arrested again, this time for violating his probation. When he was walked out to a waiting police vehicle by Osceola County Sheriff's deputies, his words were, "I'm not going back to prison. Not today. Not for a technical violation." The Osceola County Sheriff posted the perp walk video to their official Facebook page. The reason for the probation violation? Court records showed he had failed to take down his YouTube channel. He claimed he had been hacked and could no longer access the account. The years of legal consequences. Between 2022 and 2025, Jeremy DeWitt faced a cascading series of additional legal proceedings. Insurance fraud charges were filed after investigators documented what they described as a years-long effort to defraud insurance companies through staged or fabricated vehicle damage claims. Charges were filed in multiple counties. Prosecutors began treating him as a habitual felony offender, a designation that, under Florida law, significantly increases the penalties for subsequent offenses. In November 2024, he was convicted by a jury and sentenced to nearly 7 years in prison for failing to register a new motor vehicle as a requirement of his sex offender status. In January 2025, a federal judge sentenced him to 41 months in federal prison plus 1 year of supervised release and $70,000 in restitution for filing false tax returns related to his Metro State business income. Jeremy DeWitt, as of the time this script is written, is serving multiple concurrent sentences. He is in his mid-40s. The life he built around performance of law enforcement authority has cost him, by any accounting, most of his adult freedom. But the question that investigators and criminologists who have studied his case keep coming back to is not how he was caught. It is why he kept going. Why, after the first arrest, the first prison sentence, the felony record, the sex offender registration, the viral notoriety, the national television appearance, and the failed polygraph, why did he keep doing it? The answer that behavioral analysts offer is one we will return to at the end of this episode. For now, the only thing that can be said with certainty is this: Jeremy DeWitt's desire to be a police officer has outlasted every consequence the legal system has imposed on him so far. And whether that desire will ever be extinguished, even by the accumulating weight of years behind bars, remains genuinely unclear. Here is a question I want you to put in the comments right now. Jeremy DeWitt posted his own body camera footage online. He appeared on national television. He engaged with media coverage of his arrest with what appeared to be genuine indifference to consequence. At what point does this cross the line from criminal behavior into something that requires a different kind of response? And should the legal system approach compulsive impersonation differently from other crimes? Tell me where you stand. Story 2. The felon at the crime as in Michael Skeletatites Bremerton, Washington, September 2025. Not every impersonator builds a company and a YouTube following. Some of them are quieter, more local, operating in a smaller territory, with less notoriety, for a period of time before the right officer asks the right question and the whole fiction collapses. Michael Skeletatites, 4 to 9 years old, of Lacey, Washington, had been working as a security guard at a Salvation Army location in downtown Bremerton. That was his job, his legitimate job, private, unarmed security at a social services facility, a role that his employer described as entirely non-confrontational and explicitly restricted to the Salvation Army property itself. What Skeletatites was doing in addition to that job, and apparently for a significant period before his arrest on the morning of September 5th, 2025, was something very different. He had acquired a Ford Explorer. He had equipped it with blue and green police lights that could be activated from the interior. He had obtained body armor bearing the words police and SWAT in reflective lettering. He had acquired a metallic badge that read Detective Edmonds Police and carried the number 360, a 3-digit badge number that would later be one of the details that gave him away, since Edmond Police Department uses 4-digit badge numbers. He had also, at some point, begun responding to active law enforcement calls in downtown Bremerton, not as a bystander, as a participant, showing up at crime scenes, trespassing calls, and emergency incidents, introducing himself as an off-duty detective from the Edmonds Police Department, and positioning himself alongside real officers as if he belonged there. The night it fell apart. On the night of September 4th and into the early morning hours of September 5th, 2025, Bremerton police responded to two separate incidents in their downtown corridor, a trespassing call, and then, later, a fire in a parking garage. At both incidents, officers encountered a man arriving in an unmarked dark Ford Explorer with flashing blue lights, a man in full police-style body armor and tactical gear who introduced himself as an off-duty Edmonds detective named Mezzi Scaletta. At the trespassing call, Scaletta positioned himself alongside the responding officers as backup. The officers, dealing with the immediate situation, accepted his presence. One of them would later recall noting his gear and assuming he was legitimate. At the parking garage fire, Scaletta arrived again. He was speaking with officers, participating in the scene management, conducting himself with the ease and apparent familiarity of someone who had been doing this for a while. A Bremerton officer spoke with him directly. According to the officer's later report, Scaletta was fluent in the language of law enforcement. The terminology, the references to task forces and departments, the casual name-dropping of agencies and procedures. He claimed to know members of a local task force. He claimed to be a gang detective in the intelligence division at Edmonds PD. The officer, according to the Bodycam footage, told him, "I thought you were one of our detectives at first." But something wasn't sitting right. Scaletta mentioned he had retired from Baltimore City after 27 years. Then he said he had worked for the Thurston County Sheriff's Department, but left because they wanted him to work in the jail. Then he said he needed to go back and get the WAPOs and RCWs, a reference to Washington state pension and legal code systems that, to an officer with actual experience of those systems, made no particular sense in context. The inconsistencies were small. Individually, any one of them could be explained, but together and stacking up in a conversation that should have been routine, they were enough. A supervisor was called. A check was run on state license databases. No driver's license came back for Scaletta. What did come back was a prior conviction, a false bomb hoax in North Carolina in 2015 and 2016, for which he had served 185 days in jail. A call was placed to the Edmond Police Department. They had no record of any detective by that name. The badge he was wearing was not an Edmonds PD badge. The badge number format was wrong. At 6:30 in the morning of September 5th, Michael Scaletta was placed under arrest. His Ford Explorer was searched. He was found in possession of a loaded firearm, which, as a convicted felon, he was legally prohibited from carrying. A large quantity of additional police equipment was also recovered. He was booked into Kitsap County Jail on charges of first-degree criminal impersonation and second-degree unlawful possession of a firearm. The Seattle incident. In the weeks following his arrest, as Bremerton police issued public statements requesting anyone who had encountered Scaletta posing as an officer to come forward, a former co-worker did exactly that. She sent investigators a video he had shared with her through a messaging application. The video had been recorded on his own body camera. It showed Seattle firefighters responding to what had been called in as a cardiac arrest on a downtown Seattle street on June 17th, months before his Bremerton arrest. In the footage, firefighters are opening the trunk of a parked car. Inside the trunk is a man who appears to have been deceased for some time. As a firefighter examines the body, Scaletta walks toward the trunk, tells the firefighters to step away from the body, and directs them to close the trunk. They close it. The King County medical examiner subsequently determined the man in the trunk had died of carfentanil intoxication. The Seattle Fire Department, when asked about the incident, confirmed that a security guard had been present at the scene but stated that his presence had not affected their decision-making and that the scene had been appropriately turned over to the Seattle Police Department. No charges were filed in connection with the Seattle incident. But the video itself, a convicted felon in improvised police gear directing fire department personnel away from a deceased person at what should have been a secured scene, is one of the clearest available illustrations of why police impersonation carries the criminal penalties it does. The problem is not only the deception, it is what the deception enables. A fake officer at an active scene is not a neutral presence. Every instruction they give, every action they take, every direction they issue is given without training, without accountability, without the legal authority that those instructions carry when they come from a real officer. In the transport vehicle on the way to the Kitsap County Jail, the arresting officer spoke with Scaletta directly. At one point, Observing that Skeletatites had claimed extensive law enforcement history in multiple jurisdictions, the officer said, "You're telling me you're a cop for 30 years and you don't know how a jail booking works." Skeletatites' answer, "It's different out here." Here is the question I want your thoughts on. Skeletatites was hired by a security company. He was allowed to work a job that involved interacting with officers in emergency scenes. His employer said afterward that he absolutely was not allowed to have a gun or wear police markings. How much due diligence do private security companies owe their employees, their clients, and the broader public when hiring and supervising individuals in their employ? And what does this case say about the screening processes currently in place? Tell me your thinking below. Story 3. The fire chief with a hidden SWITCH Timothy Peel, La Habra Heights, California, January 2022. There are impersonation cases where the motive, however misguided, is at least comprehensible. The person wanted the authority, the identity, the feeling of being something they could never legitimately become. The desire makes a kind of sense, even when the actions don't. And then there are cases where the motive remains murky even after the arrest, where you look at who the person was, what they already had, and what they chose to do with it. And the question of why refuses to resolve itself cleanly. Timothy Peel was 34 years old in January 2022. He held a professional position, Assistant Fire Chief of the La Habra Heights Fire Department in Los Angeles County. He worked in emergency response. He had access to emergency equipment as part of his legitimate role. He understood the tools and vehicles and protocols of first response from the inside as someone who was already operating inside that world. He had a 2020 white Chevrolet Silverado 2500 HD pickup truck. And he had taken that truck to an auto shop and asked the installer to add red and blue police lights, specifically requesting that they be on a separate switch, hidden from view, so that nobody looking at the truck would know they were there. When he came in, he requested that we put in red and blue lights on a separate switch so no one would be able to tell he had red and blue lights. The installer, Ivan Garcia, told Fox 11 Los Angeles after the arrest. Garcia said he had no idea what Peel intended to use them for. What Peel used them for was conducting an authorized traffic stops. The investigation and the arrest. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's Public Corruption Unit received reports of someone impersonating a peace officer and unlawfully detaining motorists. The investigation identified Timothy Peel as the suspect. The description of the vehicle, a white pickup truck equipped with lights, matched the truck Peel drove. When investigators executed a search warrant at Peel's home in the 15,000 block of Danbrook Drive near Whittier on the morning of January 27, 2022. They arrested him on felony charges including impersonating a peace officer and false imprisonment. The false imprisonment charge is significant. Impersonating an officer is a serious crime, a felony in California. But false imprisonment is the legal acknowledgement of what an illegal traffic stop actually does to the person being pulled over. When a private citizen activates red and blue lights on a public road and signals another driver to stop, the person being stopped has no way of knowing that the stop is not authorized. They cannot distinguish between a legitimate officer and someone performing the role of one. They pull over because the alternative, continuing to drive with lights flashing behind them, is both legally and intuitively unacceptable. They are, in the legal sense, detained against their will, by someone with no authority to detain them. Every person Peel stopped on a California road in that white Chevrolet Silverado was in that position, detained by a private citizen who had no legal standing to stop them, using equipment installed with a specific intention of concealing its existence until he chose to use it. The Sheriff's Department issued a public statement asking any additional victims who had been unlawfully detained by Peel to come forward and contact investigators. How many victims there were in total was never publicly established. Peel posted $100,000 bail and was released. The case proceeded through the Los Angeles County court system. The specific problem of authority-adjacent impersonation. The Peel case represents a specific category of police impersonation that criminologists describe as authority-adjacent. Cases where the impersonator already holds a position of legitimate authority in a related field and uses that position and the equipment and vocabulary that come with it to extend their reach beyond what their actual role permits. Peel was already an assistant fire chief. He already had professional legitimacy in the emergency response base. He already had vehicles. He already had, as part of his professional role, some access to lights and sirens, the tools of the job. The step from that legitimate foundation to the unauthorized installation of hidden police lights was, in practice, a small one. The access was there. The vocabulary was there. The comfort with the environment was there. What was not there was the training, the oversight, the accountability, and the authority. This is what makes authority-adjacent impersonation particularly dangerous. A Jeremy DeWitt pulling people over in a Crown Vic with fake police markings is at least theoretically easier for a motorist to question. But an assistant fire chief in what looks like an unmarked police vehicle, with the confidence and vocabulary of someone who works in emergency services, the gap between the performance and the reality is much harder to detect from the outside. The performance is grounded in genuine professional knowledge. That is exactly what the person being stopped cannot evaluate in the moment the lights come on behind them. They don't know who installed the lights, or when, or under what authority. They know that the lights are there, that they are red and blue, and that in their experience lights like that mean stop. Ivan Garcia, the installer, said he did not know what the lights would be used for. He had been told they were for fire department use, consistent with Peel's professional role, and had installed them on that basis. A hidden switch on a separate circuit, so that nobody would know they were there. The premeditation in that detail is what most observers found difficult to move past. Here is a question for the comments on this one. Timothy Peel held a professional role in emergency services. He was an assistant fire chief. He understood the difference between the authority he had and the authority he was performing. What does this case tell us about how authority-adjacent professional roles should be monitored for misuse of official-appearing equipment? And should people in positions like Peel's face enhanced penalties when they use their professional position as a cover for criminal activity? Tell me what you think. Story 4. Why they do IT, and how real cops catch them. The psychology, the pattern, and what every driver should know. 3 cases. 3 very different men. 3 completely different contexts. A Florida funeral escort, a Washington security guard at the Salvation Army, a California assistant fire chief. And yet, running through all 3 of them, a set of common threads at behavioral. Analysts and law enforcement researchers have spent decades trying to understand and document. This final story is not about a specific arrest. It is about the bigger picture, why impersonation happens, how it gets caught, and what the existence of these cases means to the relationship between the public and the people who are actually sworn to protect them. The 3 types. Research published in the American Journal of Criminal Justice identified 3 broad categories of police impersonator, and each of the people in this episode maps clearly onto one of them. The first category is what researchers call the police enthusiast, sometimes referred to as a wannabe cop. This is a person who genuinely desired a career in law enforcement, was prevented from pursuing it through legal, personal, or circumstantial barriers, and who finds other ways to inhabit the identity they wanted. The motivation is not primarily financial. It is not predatory in the conventional sense. It is the expression of compulsion, a need to be what they cannot officially be, that proves persistent enough to override legal consequence. Jeremy DeWitt is the most documented example of this type currently in public record. He started impersonating at 18, when he was technically too young to enter the academy. Every subsequent arrest and conviction represents another data point in a pattern that has not been interrupted by prison, by probation, by sex offender registration, by viral notoriety, or by federal sentencing. The second category is what the research calls compulsive deviance, a broader grouping that captures impersonators driven less by a specific desire for police identity and more by a generalized compulsion toward the exercise of authority, the thrill of power over others, or an identity disorder that the police uniform serves to manage or express. Michael Skeletatites fits elements of this profile. He did not build a company around the identity. He did not seek public recognition of his activities. He showed up to crime scenes, participated in emergency responses, directed firefighters away from a dead body. He was exercising authority in situations where authority was being exercised, inserting himself into the infrastructure of emergency response as a participant rather than a bystander. The third category is what researchers call common criminals, people who use police impersonation purely as a tool for material gain, typically through vehicle pullovers that facilitate robbery, assault, or theft. The research found this was the most dangerous category for victims, as stops by criminal impersonators in this category were more likely to result in robbery and assault than stops by enthusiasts or compulsive deviants. Timothy Peel, whose motive for conducting traffic stops was never publicly established in full, sits in ambiguous territory. The authority-adjacent professional with access to the tools but no clear public explanation for how he was using them against motorists, how it gets caught, and why it sometimes doesn't. The research on police impersonation is notable for a finding that receives relatively little public attention. Only approximately 4 to 6% of documented impersonation cases result in an arrest. That number should be understood carefully. It does not mean that 54% of impersonators escape consequence. It means that in the cases researchers were able to document and study, nearly half did not result in arrest, which means that there is a significant body of impersonation activity that either goes unreported, is reported but not investigated to the point of arrest, or is resolved in some other way. What the research consistently shows is that the most reliable mechanism for ending an impersonation encounter, before it escalates to violence or sustained criminal conduct, is a victim calling 911 during the stop. Study after study has found that when someone being stopped by an apparent officer calls 911 to verify the stop, impersonators almost universally flee. The performance collapses the moment real law enforcement is brought into contact with the situation. This has a direct practical implication for every driver. If you are stopped by what appears to be an unmarked police vehicle, particularly in an area where you were not expecting law enforcement activity, or at a time of day that seems unusual, or if something about the stop doesn't feel right, you have both the right and the practical protection of calling 911 to verify the stop before you engage fully with the officer approaching your vehicle. Slow down. Activate your hazard lights. Keep driving slowly until you reach a well-lit public area. When you stop, call 911 or ask the officer directly, through your window, for their name, badge number, and agency. Ask the 911 dispatcher to confirm a patrol car is at your location. A real officer conducting a legitimate stop will understand this. They may be briefly frustrated by the delay, but they will not flee. They will not panic. They will not do what Jeremy DeWitt did when a real deputy arrived at his escort, curse and drive away. If the person behind the flashing lights does any of those things, you have your answer. What it costs everyone. Beyond the individual cases, beyond DeWitt and Skeletatites and Peel and the hundreds of documented cases that don't make national news, police impersonation carries a cost that extends well beyond the people who were directly victimized by a fake traffic stop or an unauthorized detention. It costs trust. Every case of police impersonation that becomes public knowledge makes a population of motorists more uncertain about the people pulling them over. It compounds and reinforces a hesitation, already present for many people for other reasons, about complying with a traffic stop by an unfamiliar vehicle. It creates legal and practical ambiguity in moments where clarity is essential for everyone's safety. The researcher who coined the phrase police wannabes noted that impersonation incidents undermine public confidence in law enforcement, particularly when victims believe the event was a legitimate police action carried out by a corrupt officer. When someone is stopped by a fake cop, detained, and then discovers a person was an impersonator, they often cannot immediately distinguish between that was a fake cop and that was a real cop behaving criminally. The effect on their relationship with law enforcement going forward is the same in either case. There is a secondary cost that receives almost no attention, the cost to the real officers who have to interrupt these performances. The Bremerton officer who told Skeletatites, "I thought you were one of our detectives at first," was, in that moment, processing the cognitive dissonance of realizing that someone he had accepted as a colleague was a convicted felon with a loaded gun and a fake badge. The deputies who have arrested Jeremy DeWitt multiple times have done so in the knowledge that his YouTube channel documented his behavior publicly, and that his next appearance in court would likely not be his last. The investigators who built the Peel case had to pull 120 patrol cars from service, review hundreds of hours of camera footage, and contact unknown numbers of potential victims. An enormous investment of law enforcement resources, dedicated to a case involving a man who was already part of the emergency services community. The moment the badge comes off, there is a specific moment in every police impersonation case that investigators describe as one of the most revealing in any category of criminal encounter. The moment the impersonator realizes the person they are dealing with is a real officer. In some cases, Skeletatites is a good example, that moment is relatively quiet. The accumulating inconsistencies, the increasing scrutiny, and eventually the direct confirmation that his story didn't check out. A man who had been operating with apparent confidence suddenly finding that confidence unsupported by any fact that would survive a phone call to Edmonds PD. In DeWitt's case, that moment played out repeatedly on his own body camera, which he continued to wear and record even when real officers were present and questioning his authority. In one of the most watched pieces of footage from his case, a real deputy directly confronts him and tells him to stop what he is doing. DeWitt's response, the verbal aggression, the direction to his employees to follow the deputy, the absolute unwillingness to step down, is a portrait of the police enthusiast at the moment of maximal confrontation. He does not retreat. He does not process a situation as something that requires recalibration. He doubles down. That doubling down, the refusal to acknowledge that the performance is over, even when a real officer is standing directly in front of him telling him so, is what makes this category of impersonation so uniquely strange to the investigators who deal with it. The ordinary criminal, when caught, typically understands that they have been caught. The compulsive impersonator, in the most extreme cases, seems to operate in a reality where being caught is simply another scene in the performance. DeWitt has been convicted. He has served prison time. He has appeared on national television and been exposed in front of millions of people. He has had his failed polygraph results broadcast on television. He has been sentenced to multiple concurrent prison terms. He has been the subject of hundreds of news stories, thousands of YouTube videos, and more public scrutiny than most people endure in a lifetime. And the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, walking him to a police vehicle after his probation violation arrest, still had to record him saying, "I'm not going back to prison. Not today. Not for a technical violation. Not I didn't do it. Not this is wrong. Just, not today. The performance was not over. It was just on pause. What you need to know, right now. Before we close this episode, there are 5 things that every driver should know. These are not theoretical guidelines. They are practical tools drawn directly from law enforcement recommendations that apply every time any vehicle with flashing lights appears in your rearview mirror in an unexpected context. First, it is legal to slow down, turn on your hazard lights, and drive to a well-lit and populated location before pulling over if you are uncertain about whether the stop is legitimate. Real officers understand this behavior and will follow you to the location. Impersonators often will not. Second, through your rolled-up window, you can ask the officer's name, badge number, and agency before you roll it down fully. You can use your phone to call 911 and ask them to confirm that there's an officer conducting a stop at your location. A real officer will wait. A fake one typically won't. Third, unmarked vehicles conducting traffic stops are legitimate in most jurisdictions. Real detectives and plainclothes officers do pull people over. But if you are uncertain, the 911 verification process applies regardless of whether the vehicle is marked or not. Fourth, badge numbers, unit numbers, and the format of law enforcement credentials vary by agency. If a badge looks different from the ones you have seen before, that is worth noting, and worth the 30-second phone call to verify. Fifth, trust your instincts. If something about a stop feels wrong, if the person's language is unusual, if their explanation doesn't track, if their behavior under questioning is aggressive rather than professional, you are allowed to say, through your window, that you are calling 911 to verify the stop. A real officer will not object to this. These tools cost nothing. They take 30 seconds. And in the documented landscape of police impersonation, where only 4 to 6% of cases end in arrest, where fake officers have conducted stops on public highways with full confidence for years, there could be the difference between a legitimate traffic stop and the worst thing that has ever happened to you. Closing. Jeremy DeWitt is in prison in Florida. He has been in and out of prison for most of his adult life. He has built, lost, and been convicted for an elaborate performance of police authority that consumed decades of his life and hurt everyone who came into contact with it. He will be released. The question of what he does after is one that Florida law enforcement has been asking themselves for 20 years. Michael Scaletti stood in a Washington courtroom on charges of criminal impersonation and unlawful possession of a firearm. He had directed firefighters away from a dead body. He had worked the active crime scenes of a city that did not know he was there. He had done it in a Ford Explorer with blue lights and a fake badge in a story that unraveled the moment someone made a phone call. Timothy Peel had a light switch installed in his truck with a specific instruction that no one should be able to see it was there. He He used it on California roads to stop drivers who had no reason to believe the truck behind them was anything other than what it appeared to be. Three people. Three completely different versions of the same fundamental act. Taking the authority of law enforcement and wearing it as their own. Not because they had earned it. Not because they had trained for it. Not because any court or commission or department had given it to them. But because the uniform was available, and the lights were purchasable, and the confidence was something they had always had in excess. The final question I want to leave with you, and I want this one in the comments at length. Do you believe the current legal penalties for police impersonation are adequate to deter this behavior? Given what you have seen in this episode, a man convicted multiple times who kept going for 2 decades, a felon who showed up to active crime scenes for months before being stopped, an assistant fire chief with a secret light switch. Does the sentence fit the crime? And if you believe it doesn't, what would adequate deterrence actually look like? Drop your answer below. Share this with someone who drives at night. And remember that the next time lights appear in your rearview mirror, you have every right to slow down, turn on your hazards, and make a 30-second phone call before you pull over. You have that right. Use it.